Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to this May 25, 2014 edition of Nightcast. The opening story tonight, a fatal gun attack at a Jewish museum in Brussels.
The area has been completely cordoned off by the police, and large crowds of people have gathered. In fact, I think a police press conference is just getting underway to update people with the latest information. But I have spoken to the Belgian Interior Minister who has come down here, and she told me that 3 people have been killed, 2 women and 1 man who have been shot dead, also another person seriously wounded. And she told me that a man got out of a car and entered the Jewish museum, apparently opened fire at random at people who were inside, that this all happened within a matter of minutes, and then ran back to a waiting car outside where there are mixed reports at the moment as to whether or not this was a lone gunman or whether or not there was a getaway driver as well, and the car sped away.
So, Duncan, your understanding is that gunman is still on the loose. Do we know if he's being pursued?
We don't know. The police didn't tell me. There was a report as well that the license number may have been taken, but as we understand it at the moment, certainly no reports that the gunman has been captured. I asked the Interior Minister whether or not she considered this as an anti-Semitic attack. She said she wouldn't say that at this stage, but clearly it's a major line of inquiry because this shooting has taken place at the Jewish Museum here in downtown Brussels.
Dear friends, that occurred on Sabbath, on Saturday, just yesterday. And the police there in Brussels, the Belgian police, have released this closed circuit television footage with
the moment of horror when a gunman walked into the Jewish museum in Brussels. The blurred image in the doorway behind him is one of his victims. Captured on security camera, the man pulls out a Kalashnikov rifle and opens fire. The people inside had no chance. He then packs up his things and seemingly walks calmly away. Today, the Jewish community mourned its dead. The victims were all shot in the neck and face and included an Israeli couple, a French woman and a Belgian man. Many are in shock, but not all are surprised.
We were very sad and disappointed to hear about this event. However, we were not surprised. People spit to the street, people say dirty Jew, people could say go back to Israel or things like that. When we sit on a daily basis, we understood that something terrible might happen.
Police are investigating a number of motives, but their main line of inquiry is that it was an anti-Semitic attack. Security has now been stepped up at synagogues and other Jewish sites across the country. It's now been over 24 hours since the shooting took place at the museum, and police appear to be struggling to identify the killer. Prosecutors say whoever carried out this attack was well prepared and probably acted alone. They're calling on the public to help. The Jewish community in Belgium is 40,000 strong, and its leaders have recently reported a rise in hate crimes. The police hope the release of CCTV images will help track down the killer. No one has claimed responsibility for the attack, and for the moment, the gunman remains at large. Duncan Crawford, BBC News, Brussels.
Thank you, Duncan. And friends, we also have closed-circuit television of the shooting that occurred in the United States in Santa Barbara, California. Closed-circuit television of the moment Elliot Rogers opened fire on a Santa Barbara deli has been released.
This was the moment Elliot Roger opened fire on a shop. The panic captured by in-store video. Watch again the fridge door on the left as a bullet strikes just over the girl's head. This is where one of his 6 victims was killed.
I don't know what you don't see in me. I'm the perfect guy. And yet you throw yourselves at all these obnoxious men.
In this chilling video posted online just hours before the attack, he said what he was going to do and why. His rejection by women was the apparent motive.
It all has to come to this. Tomorrow is the day of retribution. The day in which I will have my revenge against humanity, against all of you.
The first 3 people to die were stabbed to death at his apartment before the shooting spree began. He had clashed with his flatmates in the past. Elliot's father, Peter, is a British filmmaker, shown here with the killer's half-brother. The family had warned police of Elliot's mental illness and hateful videos. They believed he wasn't a threat, but he was meticulously planning his day of retribution. At the wheel of his crashed BMW, he carried out that final act. 6 people were left dead, 13 injured. He had targeted female students, and witnesses saw him spray the streets with bullets.
I saw the car zoom past. Luckily, he wasn't shooting whilst I was standing out on the balcony, but he hit a kid on a bike. The guy flew off the bike, and then he drove further down to the corner of the street where a lot of people were standing, because there's a lot of people out on the streets because it's quite a big thing standing out on the streets around here for parties and stuff. And he started shooting into the crowd.
People left candles to remember those killed. The shooting has traumatized this beachside college town and again raised questions over America's gun laws.
I mean, aren't we tired of this? Isn't this just... I mean, how can this go on? I mean, what are we thinking? It's just unbelievable to me that we have to do this all over again.
Friends, catching people in the emotional moment of this recent shooting in California. This next video features some of the witnesses who were there during the shooting, and from the shock and the sadness that you can see in these young people, I believe this next video will help all of us. It should help all of us be able to pray with more heart in our prayer. Oh God, thy kingdom come.
It was like an airsoft gun or something, so I was like, hey, like, what up? And I turned around and I started walking the other way. And then, like, he shot.
Pretty much, there was a BMW rolling by. I think there was 2 people inside, and one of them was shooting at innocent people. I think one girl was shot dead. The other girl was shot as well, but I think she's at the hospital. First time I saw it, I just ran away from my life, so I don't know any details.
Friends, the shooting left 7 people dead, including the suspected gunman, along with several injured. Well, we've got a lot of news tonight, friends, and the Pope is much in the news this weekend. In this video, you'll see him praying at Israel's West Bank separation barrier.
Pope Francis touched his forehead on the wall that separates Bethlehem from Jerusalem to show his concern at the failure to bring peace to the Holy Land. This is a Pope who understands the power of symbols. Israel says the separation barrier is to keep its people safe. Palestinians say Israel is grabbing land they want for a state. Later, I asked the Pope why he stopped. He said the answer would have to wait until the trip back to Rome. At an open-air mass in Manger Square, opposite the church marking the birthplace of Jesus, many Palestinians believed that Pope Francis has been signaling his support for their point of view. The Pope said this tour was going to be about religion, but it's now clear he wasn't just talking about ritual. Francis has made a big intervention into politics and diplomacy, backed, he believes, by his moral and spiritual authority. He had an embrace for the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and an invitation to meet him and Israel's president at his home in Rome. Secular leaders have run out of ideas and will about Middle East peace. But the leader of 1.2 billion Catholics seems to have plenty of both.
The Palestinians are seeing everything the Pope has said and done here in the context of one very important part for them of their strategy, and that's to try to get their arguments about statehood the way they want it into the mainstream of the international debate as part of the accepted wisdom. The fact especially that the Pope stopped at the wall to pray makes this, for the Palestinians, a much better than expected visit.
A Jordanian military helicopter took Pope Francis to Tel Aviv for the Israeli leg of his tour. He was greeted by President Shimon Peres, who, like his Palestinian counterpart, has accepted the Pope's invitation. At the airport, Pope Francis renewed his predecessor's call for Israel to live in peace and security alongside a sovereign, independent Palestine. Pope Francis is intervening in a conflict that has defeated everyone else who's tried to settle it. It's a gamble. But he looks to be a man who believes that his office has power that should be used. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Jerusalem.
My friends, Jeremy Bowen was on board the flight along with other reporters as Pope Francis took time to meet the reporters accompanying him as he travels to the Middle East. The BBC's Jeremy Bowen, who you just heard in the previous video, engaged the Pope in conversation about his previous visit to Jerusalem in 1973.
So the Pope has come to greet the journalists. He said it's not a press conference, it's a religious mission that he's on. But he's showing his, his friendly and approachable side. I suppose you'd say, as you can imagine, there's a lot of interest in what he will say, though, when he's in the Holy Land, especially in Jerusalem, because there are so many controversial issues there involving the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the position of Palestinian Christians.
Your Holiness, Jeremy Bowen from the BBC. Have you been to Jerusalem before?
Non è la prima volta per lei a Gerusalemme? No? No. Che amici?
Una volta sono stato.
Una volta prima? No.
Durante la guerra da Yom Kippur.
Ah,
non ho visto
niente. Tanti anni fa, So the Pope has just been down and greeted everybody. Everyone got a handshake and a couple of words. I asked him if it was his first time in Jerusalem. He said no, he'd been once before in the Yom Kippur War, that was 1973, and he said, I didn't see a thing.
And friends, Quentin Somerville has this report from yesterday where Pope Francis first arrived in Jordan for his Middle East visit. And this is the start of a 3-day visit to the Middle East, which also took him to Israel and the Palestinian territories today.
It's the second visit as Pope, second international visit, and his first here as Pope to the Holy Land in Amman. He will be holding Mass here at the Amman Stadium for somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 people. This will be the largest Mass that he holds during the trip. Some of the children running around here today will be taking their first Holy Communion in this audience with the Pope during this Mass. After here, he will travel to the Palestinian territories. He'll visit Bethlehem. He will also visit Tel Aviv in Israel and visit Jerusalem. So it's going to be a very packed 3 days for the Pope and his first visit here, Pope Francis, his first visit here to the Middle East.
And friends, the official announced purpose for the Pope's 3-day tour to the Middle East, during which he visited Jordan and the Palestinian territories and Israel, his announced purpose is, let me find my notes just one moment, is to improve ties with the Orthodox Church. Now, nonetheless, in this next video, Pope Francis on this 3-day tour again to the Middle East, which he visited Jordan yesterday and the Palestinian territories and Israel today and tomorrow. It's the pontiff's first visit to the Holy Land since his election last year. Ahead of the visit, BBC News spoke to people across the region about their hopes for the visit. Yolande Nell met Mahasaka, a Palestinian Christian woman from Bethlehem.
I think this visit for the Pope, it will be great for us. It will be message for the world that these people still under occupation. We love to have our freedom. We love to have our independent state. We love to have our land, especially in Crimson. This valley is very important for Beit Jala and for Christian. It's our land until now. And we are afraid after the Pope will leave the Bethlehem, the Israeli by court, they will take our land. I'm so lucky to have the permission to make the scarf for the Pope. And there is many symbols on this scarf, the key of return and the key of Vatican and the cross and the hilal for Muslims and Christians. It means that we are together in this land, we love each other, and we have one God, and this God, he needs peace in this land.
And friends, even when in Ambassador College, Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong would have Palestinians come over and speak to us in forums and assemblies, and of course they would give their viewpoint that that land over there is their land. And we have to understand when we hear the Palestinian people speak, the Arabs, the Ishmaelites, we're listening to our half brother Ishmael, or sisters, daughters, sons, sisters, brothers. They're all offspring of Ishmael, the half-brother of Isaac, from whom many of us descend. And so, it's a dispute between half-brother Ishmael and Isaac, with Ishmael largely the Arab people, the Muslim people, following the Quran, which tells them in their quote-unquote holy book, which not, even the Christian world that follows the Bible, they get the Bible all wrong, and so the Ishmaelites, they follow the Quran that tells them that Abraham took Ishmael up on the mountain to sacrifice him, and that God offered the land to Ishmael. So, they got it backwards, of course, and so they claim we want our land back, But now there's another video here where Yolande Nell, I think what's important for you to see, though, is the hopes that the Palestinian people have in the Pope, and the hope that this trip is developing, even though it's the purpose that was announced is to enlarge and improve ties with the Orthodox Church. But in this next video, Yolande Nell met Abu Khalil al-Laham, a community leader at a refugee camp in Bethlehem.
We're here in a place that Pope Francis will visit. He'll meet a group of children from the camp. Pope represents millions of Christians around the world, but his visit is also important to those of other religions. And he's a head of state, so there's a political significance. We hope he can help with the Arab-Israeli conflict. When two previous popes visited Bethlehem, they came to the refugee camps as well. The children here will deliver a message, in a natural way, about how Palestinians suffer because of Israel's occupation of the West Bank. They'll bring up the right for refugees to return to their towns and villages, and their dream to live like other people in the world, in peace and tranquility.
And friends, before we go to our next story, let's just take a quick look at the chart from the book of Revelation that lays out the seals from Revelation 6. The 6 seals are, first 6 of 7 seals are mentioned in Revelation 6. You see that first seal, the white horse. We've been talking about the Pope's visit to Jordan and the Palestinian territory and Israel, and the white horse relates to the Pope. And in our next story, we'll be relating stories that somewhat relate to the red horse, the horse of war and rumors of war and world war, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And Poland's last communist leader, General Jaruzelski, has died at the age of 90.
Wojciech Jaruzelski went to his grave an enigma. Was he a traitor who subjugated his country to communism, or a hero who staved off a Soviet invasion? It was as the trade union movement Solidarity challenged the Polish communist government that General Jaruzelski became prime minister in 1981. The Soviet leadership were worried about the growing popularity of the trade unions led by Lech Wałęsa. In the past, they'd intervened brutally to crush opposition movements in Eastern Europe. Now, Soviet troops were exercising along the Polish border. But as defense minister, the general had previously used his troops to suppress dissent, and the Soviet Union trusted him to manage the crisis. 10 months later, he declared martial law, banned Solidarity, arrested thousands, and used the ZOMO, the vicious special police, to smash the opposition. Buoyed up by Pope John Paul II, the Poles continued to challenge communism, and Jaruzelski, by now party leader and president, could neither block the Pope nor crush Solidarity. And then a new leader in the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev, turned away from repression. In 1989, Jaruzelski opened talks with a reinvigorated Solidarity. The price of a deal was elections. The communists lost and were pushed from power. It was the beginning of a tide which swept across Europe. As he dictated his memoirs, Jaruzelski argued he'd spared Poland much bloodshed. But to the end, he was hated by those he persecuted.
Friends, Egyptians go to the polls for the second time in 2 years, tomorrow and Tuesday.
Hard labor in the baking hot sun. A back-breaking job for little money. But Abdel Ghaffar has no other options. With a wife and 10 children to support, the wheat harvest season brings him some much-needed income. He tells me he is nearly 60 years old and has a disabled foot. Yet, he can think neither about retiring nor about receiving proper medical care. Abdel Ghaffar lives in a small village in the southern province of Asyut, the poorest in Egypt. This area has been neglected by successive Egyptian governments. He and his wife Fatma hope that the new president will be able to end their daily struggle for their basic needs.
We want social justice. We need bread, fuel, access to good medical care.
Fatma's wish is simple.
I just want to have a proper house. That's all we need.
Charities in the province try to help, but they can't fulfill everybody's demands.
These people come from surrounding villages each month to receive financial aid. This is their only way to survive their hard living conditions. But charities like these can only offer a short-term solution.
After the 2011 revolution, the hope was that money would finally go to the most needy. But neither former President Mohamed Morsi nor the current transitional regime managed to achieve real economic reform. Now, 26% of the Egyptian population live below the poverty line on less than $2 a day. Government advisors say the challenge for the future president is to reverse this trend.
The problem of poverty is too big to be overlooked because it can create social tension and could disrupt the political process as a whole.
Both candidates, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and Hamdeen Sabbahi, have put poverty high on their agenda. But families who live from hand to mouth won't care about eloquent political statements. They just want their suffering to come to an end as soon as possible. Sally Nabil, BBC News, Asyut.
Thank you, Sally. Ukraine is also holding elections. They're preparing to hold perhaps its most important election since splitting from the Soviet Union in 1991, with hopes that it might bring an end to months of political crisis. However, in the east of the country, separatist militia are occupying several towns and are preventing the vote from taking place. Mark Lowen visited an electoral commission in one of the towns, one of the only places in the east where the Kiev authorities maintain control.
This is the exception to the rule here in eastern Ukraine. A district election commission building that is still open and functioning, and where the Ukrainian authorities believe they can hold this presidential election. We're in the town of Krasnoarmysk, about an hour's drive northwest of Donetsk, and the Ukrainian government believes that they can hold the election here because they are still in control of this area. The pro-Russia armed groups have not yet managed to penetrate and seize this area. So what's happening now is that these election commission staff are waiting to go inside this building and take out the ballot papers, which will be distributed to 137 polling stations in this region, ready for people to vote. So the bundles of ballot papers are being divided up here inside the commission building, ready to be sent out to the different polling stations. And you can see across the walls all 21 candidates standing for the post of President of Ukraine. Now, a lot of election commission buildings and polling stations in the east of the country have been forced to close as staff have been abducted, held at gunpoint and voter lists seized by the pro-Russia armed groups. But they hope here that this one will be able to stay operational throughout the election. And of course the authorities in Kiev are determined for voting to take place at least in some parts of the region, so that they can say that whoever becomes president will have at least some degree of legitimacy in the east of Ukraine.
And friends, over in Thailand, protests have continued in the Thai capital Bangkok despite the country's new military rulers.
In Thailand, the mood of defiance is growing. Anger at the army spreading. Take your guns and go home, she shouts. This is a country now under martial law, but many have had enough of coups. Get out, they shout. The military has banned gatherings of more than 5 people. But it was the soldiers who came to stop the protest who got trapped, sweltering in the heat. The army insists it's here to bring harmony. After months of political turmoil. But it's stifling any criticism.
Well, this is exactly what the army doesn't want. It's coup designed to bring peace and order back to Thailand, descending, well, into just street scuffles like this.
In the melee, this woman fainted. She was revived. But outside, the soldiers, exhausted, were on the point of collapse too. One of Thailand's most outspoken journalists had to report to the military today. He's now detained, along with around 200 politicians, academics and others. We filmed Pravit Roshanapruk just after the coup happened. He was determined to bypass the military's censorship.
What are you going to say here?
I'm reporting on Twitter the picture of the protest. We can't go on like this. We have to ensure that we can develop civilian supremacy over the military.
Today, in the middle of Bangkok, unable to quell the protest, the soldiers beat a retreat. It was humiliating, and they were jeered. The army is promising there'll be a new constitution and a new prime minister. It says democracy has brought violence and losses to Thailand. But many Thais don't believe they're better off in a military dictatorship and don't want the army deciding who rules them. Ben Grammaticus, BBC News, Bangkok.
And friends, the attitudes of mobs and seditions continues elsewhere around the world. At least 10 people have been killed during an attack on the Somali parliament in the capital Mogadishu by Islamist militants from the Al-Shabab. Witnesses said heavily armed gunmen stormed the compound after a bomb was detonated at the entrance. Mark Dole has this report.
After the initial blast at the main entrance to the Parliament building, gunfire. Exchanges between the security forces and Al-Shabab fighters. There was panic around the building where members of Parliament were debating what's left of the Somali economy.
Fighting is going on in the Parliament complex, and we're fighting rebels inside the building, but we've evacuated members of Parliament.
The attack was then claimed by Al-Shabab. Parliament was a legitimate military target, they said. But civilians were hurt, including this MP.
I was wounded inside the Parliament building. Luckily, I've survived.
At one point, it appeared that government soldiers and police had spotted one of the attackers. Eyewitnesses saw a number of dead bodies in military fatigues, but they could have been Somali government soldiers or Al-Shabab. The two tend to wear similar uniforms, a fact that confuses and terrifies ordinary Somalis. Attacks on prestige targets like the Somali parliament attract attention, of course. That's part of their purpose for Al-Shabab. In recent years, coalition African Union forces, paid for by the West, have made military advances against the insurgents who want to establish an Islamic state. These are Ugandan soldiers in central Somalia earlier this year, spearheading a successful offensive against Al-Shabab. But the Islamists have shown their capacity to come back again and again. It's generally accepted that if the African Union force was not in Somalia, the government there would quickly fall. Mark Doyle, BBC News.
Thank you, Mark. Friends, some of our brethren would be very interested in what's happening in Brazil, where hundreds of demonstrators have taken to the streets of Sao Paulo in the latest show of opposition to the World Cup in Brazil. With the soccer tournament just 3 weeks away, public protests have been mounting. Many argue that the money would be better spent on health, education, and social housing. Elaine Jung reports.
For hours they marched through Sao Paulo, chanting, "There will be no World Cup." Heavily policed, Brazil's largest city is clearly on edge. This is the latest in a string of public protests over the soccer tournament.
We're here today against the World Cup legacy in Brazil, against FIFA's influence in Brazil, our laws and public policies.
Protesters once again voiced their anger over the $15 billion spent on the tournament. Many argue it's money that could have been used to lift disadvantaged communities out of poverty. And there's growing backlash over what they say is a government failure to deliver promises to improvements on social services.
It is a cup of the corrupted thieves, when in Brazilian schools our children are learning the ABCs sitting on the floor.
The protest follows on the heels of a rally of 15,000 people on Thursday. As the World Cup draws closer, authorities are bracing for a repeat of last year's violent demonstrations. Elaine Jung, BBC News.
Friends, we go just on Sunday nights, we often go just a little bit longer than our usual half-hour program. Of course, once in a while, I extend the program to 45 minutes or an hour if there's something really significant happening in the world. We're going just a little bit over tonight, and I want to close with the report we had with another reporter reporting on this earlier. But because Pope Francis has prayed at the barrier Israel is building in and around the West Bank, and because this was an unscheduled stop, which came as the Pope traveled to Manager Square to deliver an open-air Mass, Yolanda Nell has a report a little different than the one we heard earlier.
There was also a very symbolic moment, a moment that I think Palestinian Christians in particular will really appreciate, when the Pope got out of his vehicle as he was driving here to the square, and he made a prayer next to the 8-meter-high concrete wall that Israel has built that separates Bethlehem from Jerusalem. It's part of the West Bank barrier that Israel is building in and around the West Bank, saying it's needed for security, but the Palestinians see this wall, this barrier, as a land grab.
So, after the Pope's visit, we can probably expect that the hopes of the Palestinian people are going to be increased significantly. And, you know, I've got just a couple of notes here I could go through. Let me tell you what to anticipate there. Pope Francis has prayed at the concrete barrier Israel is building in and around the West Bank after urging the Israelis and Palestinians to end a conflict described as increasingly unacceptable, quote, unquote. In an unscheduled, that unacceptable conflict has gone on since practically the time Ishmael was born and Isaac was born back thousands of years ago. But in an unscheduled stop at the second day of his maiden visit to the Holy Land, my head notes here say, Pope Francis rested his head against the barrier on which graffiti reads, "Free Palestine." The Argentine Pope was elected in March 2013 following the shock resignation of Benedict XVI. And, okay, those are my head notes right there. Friends, that's all we have for tonight, this Sunday night report. God willing, and the creek don't rise. We'll be back again tomorrow night, Monday evening, with the current day's news. We'll have some updates for you on what happened with regard to elections that end tonight in Europe for the 766 members of the European Parliament that are being elected in elections that have been running the past 4 days, elections that end tonight. We'll have news on that for you in tomorrow night's report. Again, God willing, Creek Don't Rise. We'll be back again Monday night. Until next time, your host Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth saying thanks for joining me tonight, and so long, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on COGTV.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the COGTV.org video archive.